Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So this episode, really pleased to have on David from Tookie's Mag and the Associated Sidebar podcast. Going to be talking about his book, his novella, Improvidence, as well as some of the shorter pieces he's published online on the Tookie's Mag Substack. Thanks very much for coming on, David. Second time. This time you're not talking about satanic pedophile conspiracy theories like the Programmed to Kill episode we did together.
Yeah, I needed a shower after that last one. That was absolutely more than I expected when I suggested it. Well, names started it, but when I suggested it, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. A huge honor to be included in this series of interviews you're doing.
Oh, thank you for writing Improvidence. I really enjoyed it. So Improvidence is, I'm not sure quite how to classify it. Like I've seen it described as post-apocalyptic or science fiction. Those don't feel quite right to me. It's a post-collapse adventure novel in Ohio and West Virginia. How would you classify it? You do call it an overnight novel at the beginning, which is a really nice evocative name for it because it's short, brisk, very to the point. But in terms of marketing a book, saying it's an overnight novel probably doesn't mean something to anyone who hasn't already read Improvidence.
The overnight novel is actually from a long-running debate I've had with a few people about the term novella and novelette, and it's kind of like a beta male term, a novella. It just doesn't sound cool. Novelette doesn't sound cool. So I said, what if we called it an overnight novel? And the idea isn't so much that the material has to be grim or dark. It's just that you could theoretically read it in an evening or over like a weekend, right? It's like, or like within like a 24-hour period with rest in the middle. So that's the origin of that term. I kind of want to meme it if I write more novellas, which I think I'd like to. Or I have one or two ideas for some more I'd like to put out soon. As for Improvidence itself, Arthur Powell actually called it, was it degrowth fiction or something like that? He had a term for it from a magazine that went out of print a long time ago. But I would just say it's the term I use a lot is post-apocalypse, or which is, I think people from Fallout use that, or it's just like it's about a new civilization rising out of the old one, and it's focused not so much on the idea of collapse, but sort of this earth abides, like what grows, trying to create a more positive set of ideas and vision for a world that could theoretically exist. It's a bit of like a pastiche and exaggeration in ways. It's not what I think exactly the world would look like, but hopefully it presents like a clear image of, in a non-proselytizing way, but a clear image of, what a future could be. But more than that, it's just supposed to be a fun story. And it's really, it's kind of, it has an inspiration, sort of a Weird Tales vibe with maybe a lot of sort of Gene Wolfe, Book of the New Sun type narrative qualities that is just, hopefully at the end of the day, just a fun, fast read, and then it has some ideas behind it you can think about.
Yeah, a Weird Tales adventure novel might go some of the way to describing what's going on. When I say Weird Tales, I don't mean Weird Tales in a Lovecraftian sense. It's not a supernatural novel. And maybe why I slightly recoil from post-apocalyptic is because much that comes out that is described as post-apocalyptic is quite hackneyed, quite stereotyped. Whereas this felt fresh and different. Yeah, maybe adventure novel or adventure story comes closer to the mark than other genre tags, but I guess also getting too obsessed with genre tags beyond marketing is probably not that useful. Like ultimately, Improvidence is what it is. To describe it in terms of being some sort of genre is more to sell it rather than to enjoy it.
I struggle with genre tags. It was briefly did well within the colonial fantasy or colonial science fiction, which I didn't even know was a thing on Amazon subtags.
I guess, given some of the plot, that does make sense. So I really don't want to spoil things, but in brief, Am I right in thinking that the main character is just called the Captain? I couldn't
That's
find
right,
his.
yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't find his name anywhere. I was I was worried I was a complete dumbass and just completely missed it.
I'm the dumbass because I didn't realize it till like 3 chapters in, and I was like, well, I guess I'm sticking with this.
But yeah, this man who sets off with a companion from Ohio, where there is post some sort of collapse, and the collapse is never. It's not said what it was. I guess within the moral framework of the moralists, which is it seems to be the dominant religion, at least within Columbus, Ohio. I'm not sure what the rest of Ohio is like. At least within the moral framework of the moralists, it was because of some sort of impiety or immorality on behalf of those who came before. But a collapse happened, and now these two men are venturing out into the wilds of West Virginia to Harper's Ferry to survey, to try to establish treaties with the local tribal people for trade and possibly for military expansion. And I don't really want to say more than that because it's a short book and I don't want to just give everything away. And also, actually, what I found I got the most from in this book was it's sort of cliche to say, but the journey. Your way of describing, particularly the landscape, is really special. Very, very comfy, actually. I didn't anticipate it to be quite as cozy, especially the first half of the book.
Oh, thank you. Somebody else said that too. I'm not sure. I didn't have cozy in mind, but I can see it because it's you were talking about your recent Lolita episode with Levi about sort of having that moment of inspiration for Tower and it's sort of like a couple ideas clash. And then you're like, okay, I have this, it like forms a cohesive vision. Like, okay, I really want to make something like this. And for Improvidence, that moment definitely was kind of the feeling of being lost in like an autumn forest. And so I think that maybe comes across as cozy to a lot of people, that sort of a lot of like autumnal visions and smells. And then the other two aspects of it, one of them is actually kind of cozy. One is maybe more adventure, is like books I had been reading at the time. And one of them is Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which actually is a very cozy read. I guess I have more thoughts on that if you're a bit of a digression. Maybe I don't know if you want to go into like background or inspiration or if you want to just stick with my summary for now. But then the other one is Diary of Nicholas Cresswell, which was what we were supposed to read for the last one, the recording we did before we switched to Program to Kill.
It was a much cozier book.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about child sacrifice or people being chopped up and put in barrels or whatever. The sort of like the three things that were experientially, that the autumn forest. The Diary of Nicholas Cresswell is probably the plot. This is sort of a bizarro, because in Nicholas Cresswell, that's a real story of an Englishman in 1775 who travels to America right before the Revolution, not realizing what's happening, lands in Virginia, goes to Ohio region roughly on an exploratory mission, meets some natives, and then he gets under house arrest as the revolution kicks off, and there's a whole escape thing. And so it's an actual journal, it's written like a journal. I found that super inspiring. And so in some ways, this is a bizarro version where we're starting in Ohio in a different era world, and we're traveling eastward this time into this lost east. And a lot of the writing style, because a lot of the writing style, it cribs on that older style of prose and phrasing, is very Nicholas Cresswell inspired. And then the Legend of Sleepy Hollow aspect is both, I guess, part of what you were talking about as the comfy aspect of these. There's so much like makes you hungry when you read Legend of Sleepy Hollow. There's so many like descriptions of pumpkins and pies and food and this like comfy peasant life. And that was definitely a huge aspect in terms of the comfy aspect. Nicholas Cresswell is interesting. It had a lot of alienating things for me reading through it. It had a lot of, because he's an outsider to America. He's an outsider to our modern view of the American Revolution. And so I think maybe some of my ideas and inspiration to have this discordant, not clear description of like what the world is like, and like holding your hand through some of it, and you're sort of like, whoa, what is that? Which is very Gene Wolfe. I think that comes from Nicholas Cresswell in a way. but yeah, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I found fascinating for that. And then also, I'd just gone down a bender of reading up about the history of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it basically got completely, in our minds, it was completely rewritten in a way. Because when you say that The Legend of Sleepy Hollow to someone today, they usually think of a horror story. And I don't know if you ever read, I know it's probably not as popular in the Australian education system, but do you ever read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I don't think many people out of the US do, but you probably have seen like a film or a cartoon of it, I would guess, or not even that.
As a kid,
Yeah.
yeah, but the memories of it are pretty, I'd say, impressionistic. Not many declarative facts are left.
That was kind of my experience too, though, even as an American, where I read it in 5th grade or something. And I thought I had read it, but what I actually read was a kid's version of it. And so rereading it was this bizarre experience of like, whoa, this is not what we thought it was, or what I thought this story was about. It's completely different. It's very like, there's like a second layer of understanding to it. And then I don't know, I have a whole lot of ideas on that. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think those 3 things together are what inspired it. And I think that's where the comfiness angle comes from, because the actual text of that is very like, there's a lot of warmth and happiness and like peasant stuff, even though Improvidence is meant to be lean a little bit more maybe in the thriller adventure direction than that does.
Yeah, it's interesting how an author can have certain ideas coming into a book and the book can form itself according to its own interior logic in a way that ends up surprising them, in that you seemed sort of surprised that I and at least one other person have described this as comfy. But it's comfy, but there is a sense of the alien in it. It's not the comfiness of, say, being in your own house where you know where everything is and it's raining outside and it's warm inside. There's a real sense of exposure and adventure, both striking out from Ohio towards Harper's Ferry, which is the more sedate, atmospheric part of the novel. I guess, yeah, it's sort of a rainy autumn day is the comfiness of this book. A rainy autumn day in a landscape you don't know well is maybe how I'd sum up that feeling. And that sense of the alien is reinforced very nicely with aspects of, I guess you might call it science fiction. So there are, I think they're called arches, which are these huge wind turbines built into hills and mountains. And they're these arches that are broken down, that are just dotting the landscape, these remnants from a past age that our 2 adventurers will pass through, and will be these clear parts of the landscape that the reader is not familiar with, but it's also not overbearing in a sci-fi obsession with technology way. It's quite subtle, which I really, really appreciated. Another aspect of the comfiness is the prose. So you've already noted it's got this slightly archaic feeling, but it's not overbearing, which is nice. I think you struck the right balance there, because if it were much further in that direction, it might feel a bit put on. So you stopped just short, which is
of the costume level. Yeah.
Yeah. At the level where it's nice and it draws you in without feeling sort of contrived. Also, the pace of the book is nice. So this is a very short book. I'm not sure how many
I think it's 23K words.
Yeah. It's a speedy one. You managed to pack a lot in, and I think a lot of that is because the prose is quite, I'm not going to call it low resolution. You don't describe a lot of stuff in an enumerative sense. You don't give a very detailed description of a landscape. Instead, you manage to pick a few images and a few words, and in an impressionistic sense, you give the reader these few touchstones so that in their own head they can construct the feel of the landscape or of a particular scene, which I found really effective because it's both very, very vivid but very compact. It allows the book to keep moving along. And I found that really nice. The tone of the book also shifts. I feel it's roughly 50-50. At about the halfway mark, it becomes, and I won't spoil more than this, it becomes more sinister, or I guess less comfy and more alien or more hostile. The evocative prose remains, but it's describing something that's harsher, and I don't know. It's less golden red autumn leaves in the light, and something more grey and disturbing. But how did you come across that prose style? Have you always written like that, or were you trying to write in a very pared back, rapid way?
No, thank you for the kind words. I kind of everything I write is in a different style, so I would say this was probably the most pared back I've done. Like previously things I've done, I've been criticized for being like overly descriptive, and this was definitely
easy to do.
Yeah, yeah,
Really easy to do.
It was an effort for me. Okay, well, so part of it also comes from the origins of this. The reason I wrote the first chapter of this was there was a call for submissions to my friend Miles McNaughton and Rhyme and Grind. They run Unreal Press. It's a Weird Tales inspired sort of anthology series. So like, oh, we're putting out a call for short stories. I was like, okay, I'll put something together, and that was Improvidence, where I started out. It was supposed to be a short story, and I just kept writing, and in about 10K words, I was like, this is not going to be, this is not going to make it. I'm not even halfway there. And so I kept trying to, just for like pure word count reasons, like keep it trim as I was starting out. And the style just sort of stuck in that way. And then also, again, go back to the inspiration of Nicholas Cresswell. His is like a literal journal. Improvidence is just sort of an unexplained first-person retrospective narration. But it actually, when I wrote the first chapter, the first draft of it was a journal. And so I think having that journalistic mindset also makes you be a little more spare, because it's more someone recounting their own past experiences and like what was vivid to them and what stuck out with them. And then I I edited the first chapter, so it was no longer that way. And I went forward in a kind of journalistic, but not a journal style. And so I definitely, and it was a focus of mine. I wanted every chapter to be as trim as possible and kind of have those thriller pacing. I think every chapter is about 1,000 words or so, which usually my chapters are more like 4,000 words in the past. So that was a big deviation for me. But I kind of, once I got in the groove of it, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, because I can go on for a while about, the leaves were the color of amber and her eyes glowed like it actually can be a lot of fun as an author to kind of spin off. And I think it has a place in a lot of books, but this one I really wanted it to feel, I wanted to lean more into that thriller energy as things kicked off, especially, and just they can just pick it up and fly through it, especially as a new writer. It's hard to get people to pick it up and read it. And one of my hopes after I decided, so basically I wrote the first 10 chapters or so. And then I was like, I don't even know how I can put this out or where. So I ended up just pausing and sitting on it for 6 months. And then later I went and I hurried up and finished it 6 months later. And maybe that gap also like gave me time to think about like that I wanted it to be short and to maybe be a way people could give me a shot or be more willing to give me a shot, because as a novella, it's less of a time commitment, less of a cost commitment to, just see if you'll click with it.
Yeah, it's also, in part, it's just, it happened to be the time that I came to the book. I was reading a lot of longer work, so it was really refreshing to have something that is so focused. Yeah. It's also interesting, something I like is in your approach to storytelling, the various dangers faced by the main character, by the captain, but also by Jeremy, his companion for much of the book. How initially the danger in the book, because there is a sense of danger, or at least of exposure, how initially it's a sense of exposure in the wilderness. It's almost a natural danger of, say, falling down a hole and breaking your leg. And as the book progresses, you then have a kinetic danger, so the danger of someone spearing you through the chest, and then there's also this sense of moral danger. So the society that the captain lives in is a very moral society. It's called moralist. They subscribe to moralist principles. And through it's even from the beginning, once you're made aware of it, there are hints of moral danger. So, for example, you find there's a graveyard of what seem to be malformed babies, or the skeletons of malformed babies beside plastic refuse from the society that came before. And so there's this sense of the moral danger of the past compounded with the moral danger of those currently living in West Virginia who are presumably continuing on with some sort of infanticidal practice. And then, I don't want to spoil too much about the relationships in the book, but the sense of moral danger continues to grow through the book. Yeah. Was this something you were consciously doing, comparing these different types of danger? Or did that just come about as you were writing the book naturally?
I think they're related. And so like the horniness angle is probably where it comes from. I mean, there's no pretty way to say it. Because the story's about a guy who's in his early 20s. And as someone who's been in his early 20s, a lot of the moral danger and like your ability to walk into complete fucking life-destroying death traps as a young man is sexual. And I wanted that to be a main component. In that picture I mentioned earlier, like what the story is about in my head, it was primarily about this young guy goes out and he goes to meet Bethy and her family, where they go out to meet them at the farm, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And that whole arc was the core and like the inciting, like this is the vision of it. And he gets sort of this battle of, and there's an earlier sort of sexual temptation he like resists and is a part of it. And maybe the book is I don't know if it's too horny or not horny enough, but that I think is an important thing to include, or I wanted to include it as like a blunt, I don't know, a way of the part of the horror of being a young man is like the temptation of sex without realizing the consequences. And not even like the temptation in a theoretical way, but like in the just like this constant drive. But I did not want the book to feel horny, if that makes sense. So hopefully it comes across, not this guy is like an absolute hound dog, but maybe he's slightly prideful, and that there is this recurring temptation in an empathetic way. So that was, and the natural danger emanating from that is partly from that. A lot of people, and I don't want to spoil it, but you know, one of the mysteries a lot of people don't get, I think I should never write a mystery novel or anything, because I don't think people picked up on the mysteries, is like the mystery of the dead children, which is like is deeply connected to the sexual temptation aspect. I wasn't
completely clear myself on the provenance of the dead children. I was wondering, was it incestuous or some sort of experimentation, either from the preceding civilization or from the tribal peoples around? I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't sure if it was a metaphor for abortion.
It's not. No. Someone else thought it was supposed to be a metaphor for abortion too, which is accurate. I think it's a fault on my part to not make it more clear. But I wanted it to be, I guess I wanted the book to be such that you didn't need to answer that question. And it could have just been this like vague horror. Because even the protagonist isn't 100% sure what was going on with the dead children. And so I guess this is like big spoilers. Like if you're willing to pick it up, I'll put it on sale actually whenever this interview comes out, if anybody wants to pick it up. But the premise of the mystery is, all the women of West Virginia, if you notice, they all look the same. Like they're all red-haired. They're all like fair-skinned. But all of the men of West Virginia are not fair-haired or red-haired or pale-skinned, right? The black man with the red-haired wife they meet, who's like the friend of Jeremy, and everyone's like, oh wow, this guy got cucked. So I guess that's part of the sexual aspect of it. Though that's what they think. And then later they meet the tribal men, and they are they meet Bethy and her mother, and Bethy's like, he's not my father, right? And then later they meet the tribals, and the tribals are Virginians, who are described as like an ethnicity, who are bronze-skinned, more like South American or Native American looking. Like that's just, the tribals are actually Virginians. They're Virginians who have gone tribal very recently. Like that's sort of the implication of the mystery of the fort. But yet all of the children are described as essentially white, like they're very fair. And so the implication, along with the grays I was hoping to create, is that it's basically they've mutated. And there's like, I forget there's a term for it in nature when like females are born with self-fertilized eggs, like clones of themselves. And it's like the only sci-fi element of the story.
So
one of like
just
two.
Autopoetic.
Yeah. And the other one, and there's another hint of that where they reference, there's like people that are, what's the word for it? When you're born with both genitalia in like New Jersey, they talk about people that are poisoned by plastics and things that have had these like slight, this is not X-Men powers. It's like sexual deformations. And so the idea is that the females have had, or at some point, a woman had a sexual deformation where she was born self-fertilized with her own little clone eggs, basically. So she will sort of give birth every so often to a clone of herself. And then the idea is it's been this creeping thing north from wherever, because they keep saying how this area is more empty than we thought it would be. And there's all these women here, and women all look the same. And it's hinted again at the end where he's like, oh, I can tell there's like something weird with these women. I don't know. I'm just going through my whole like my lore spiel, but that was my hope is sort of the ultimate mystery. If you watch for certain clues and if it bothers you, if like because remember they find more dead children later too, at Bethy's house.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's the deepest lore that a few people have gotten, but vast majority have not. And I think it's on me for not giving stronger clues at the end.
That's really interesting. Because I mentioned was it a metaphor for abortion? And you said someone else brought that up too. What was counting against that for me is that would feel so on the nose, like just a very obvious thing. And that was at such variance with the rest of the book where you have a lot of trust in the reader. You'll just throw something quite important in there, and it might be contained in a sentence or two and then move on. And for you to have otherwise been so subtle with things and then bring out quite a heavy-handed metaphor like that struck me as very odd, which is why I really discounted that particular reading of it.
Yeah. Other ones people had like the incest theory about it or just that people, there was a few other theories I've seen, but that was, I guess, the intended one. I don't know how I could have put out clearer without just saying it outright, which I feel like ruins the fun of it. Like I feel like the part of the fun, at least for me, of the second half of it is supposed to be you know something is wrong. Everyone knows something is wrong, but you don't totally piece the pieces together. And then at the end, even the protagonist is like, he knows he's messed up. What he doesn't realize is that he's kind of introduced like a cancer into his society in a way, in these sort of, because part of it is it creates this population collapse situation where you have, I guess it ties back to the female sexuality where, you feel obligated to help this person, affection towards this person, and they're not doing anything wrong, but it sort of feeds into a male anxiety about female dependence. Is the idea. Well, also, I guess my hope was to play off of the idea of like the witch of the woods or the witch, and that he's kind of fallen into the control of these witches. So it's kind of playing with some of these old ideas in a way that at the end you can kind of piece together like, oh wow, he kind of introduced something really dangerous into his society, and he kind of gets it, but he kind of doesn't. And you can enjoy it. Hopefully, I really did want it to be you could read it and not quite get that mystery, but get the other mysteries, right? Like the fort, like some of the Bethy stuff, without understanding the whatever you call it, the self-cloning, self-pregnant, more sci-fi-y element.
Yeah, it works nicely, and I don't think you'd necessarily need to make it more obvious what happens, because that ambiguity works well. Like you said, the captain gets back to Columbus, and something's not right. And at least he seems to put it down to he's not lived up to his moral ideals. That seems to be most of the dissonance in his head, or at least how he seems to explain it to himself. And so it can work on that level as well. And then it becomes more interesting if you, the reader, have a sense that something else is wrong. And even if you can't quite put your finger on it, that tension is interesting.
Yeah, we'll see. If I ever do a sequel, I'll probably have to like state this more clearly, like early on, just so people get, because I think it's important. I'm such an idiot. I ended the book originally right at when they leave Bethy's house the last time, if you remember that part. And so it misses the whole return to Ohio. And I asked my buddy Gabe, who I do the podcast with, him and Ant Magazine, Hartley, they beta read it, that early version. They're like, this is way too easy. Like, we have no idea what the fuck is going on. So I added that whole section hoping to provide more hints, but it ended up having a lot of other content too. It has one or two additional hints, but yeah, I still think I should have put in like 10% more, just lesson learned. Maybe in a revised edition if I ever do that.
In terms of the landscape, because the landscape is such a significant part of the novel, why did you pick that particular part of America? Are you from there? Have you spent a lot of time there? Did the landscape just inspire you in some way?
Yeah, I'm from vaguely that area, and I've got like experience with more West Virginia than Ohio, but I have been to Ohio a little bit. I liked it, one, because it is so considered so boring and domestic and common, right? Like if someone says, oh, something happened in Ohio, you're like, oh, I don't know. Our current bias for some reason is that, Ohio is the boring place. It's the white bread place. And then to say, okay, well, in this future, it's not that it's this, it maybe in some ways it's a sort of a haven of stability, but it's a very alien place to you now. And I know Harper's Ferry pretty well. And so it's sort of and like I mentioned earlier, it's a riff off of the Nicholas Cresswell adventure, is that in reverse. And so he didn't actually, I don't think he went to Harper's Ferry, but he went to Ohio. And so it's like, this would be a cool way to explore this sort of like post-apocalyptic American landscape by going to, a familiar place made alien. And then hopefully via the descriptions and sort of that Gene Wolfe, like the character assumes much more than you do, and you get these sort of like odd reveals, like, oh, they rode bicycles, like who's riding bicycles, they and just these sort of like lurches into additional clarity, the style that he is like the master of, and I try to work in here. It makes it feel strange, and so yeah, that's probably my main. And also I just liked it because I spent a lot of time at Google Maps, like looking at like how far places were from each other. So everything is actually in the book. It's spaced, and like the way spacing is described is pretty accurate. I even had to like revise a few things to make it make sense in terms of timeline and how long the journey would be.
So I didn't have Google Maps open while I was reading it, but I was looking at pictures of Harper's Ferry particularly because it's an important landmark in the book. And it was very satisfying how things lined up.
Yep.
Nicely.
Yeah. I've been on that hill.
Nodding to myself and going, as I was reading.
Yeah, I could see it. Yeah, no, I've been at least twice on top of that hill. And so I had the exact image in my head too when I was writing it out, as this sort of, there's the parting of the river, there's that beautiful like train tunnel. Yeah, it's a really, really unique spot, more so than I thought until I actually wrote it out. And I had such a clear, like a crystal clear image in my mind.
So one thing I did like, so I read Improvidence, and then I read an article you published. I forget when exactly you published it, but it was reasonably recently on Substack, on the Tookies Mag Substack. I'll put the link to it in the show notes. Called Didactic Fiction is Good, Actually. And I thought it was a really nice companion piece to Improvidence. What I found most interesting in your Didactic Fiction is Good, Actually piece was you were saying it's didactic I might be, yeah, I'm extrapolating slightly from what you said, but didactic might be the wrong term. It's more whether a piece of writing has an implicit or explicit moral framework. Almost in the way of, say, in a novel, you can have implicit or explicit physics. So you'd say it's rare in a book you're going to specify how gravity works. It's just it's an assumed physics, and the fact that things are consistent in the book in a physical sense says that there is an implicit system of physics functioning. Similarly, you don't have to state explicitly what the moral framework is, but the fact that things are consistent and make sense from a moral perspective says that there's at least an implicit morality at play. And given how much of Improvidence involves the captain thinking about his morality, I found your discussion of didacticism in fiction really, really interesting. Do you want to talk about that more? What were you trying to say in that piece, actually?
I was a little bit with the image. I was trying to get some bait people, get some outrage, because everyone, when they hear the word didactic fiction, everyone's hackles go up. And one of the big descriptions, or I spend some time writing about a lot of didacticism. What we're actually criticizing is like crude didacticism, right? It's
Yeah.
It's someone writing, my enemies are pedophiles, or who is it? Who wrote The Fountainhead?
Ayn
Rand.
Rand, the most subtle fiction author ever to have graced the earth.
Yes.
Look, my opinion is probably slightly unpopular in that I'll, to an extent, defend Ayn Rand. In that I think in Atlas Shrugged, there's a good 300-page book buried in there. If she just dials back all of the 50-page monologues about the function of money.
Yeah.
It's a book that I find very fun and funny because you'll have, say, a main character who's a steel mill owner who's built this empire by the sweat of his brow, being saved by an international copper mining playboy striking unionists and things like that. Like that. Just the fact that someone wrote a book about that, I find very funny. But I'll also completely acknowledge, it's the most unsubtle thing ever written in human history. It's completely absurd. So, yes.
But not to say she doesn't have charms, or that anyone that doesn't have charms. But I think the term is largely... I'm trying to, I guess, differentiate between that didacticism and the didacticism, like you were said, of having this epistemological view of the world, whether implicit or explicit. And the term I'm leaning more to is moral certitude. You just have this clarity, whether it's explicit or not. And so I'm trying to divorce those two ideas. I'm still going to include didacticism, and then I'm doing a follow-up article with a few more ideas. And I'm going to include didacticism in the title again because it gets people mad, and so they pay attention. But ultimately, I guess, the argument is, as you said, I think for a human mind to conceive of a piece of fiction, whether that's a book or a film or whatever, to create it, I think you have to conceive of it through a lens of a morality that exists, right? Like with gravity. Right, you're conceiving of it in this kind of, there's a cause and effect that happens, and so I think you have to, in order to write a story, because there's a cause and effect constantly, the repercussions for events. You have to have, I guess, some kind of understanding of what causes what in the world, and I think that can be one of the reasons people can't struggle to grapple with art from other communities, is just because they have that different foundation of expectation of how things work. And I think it's part of the big reason a lot of modern stuff coming out of Hollywood or whatever feels so fake, is because they just have a very different belief system of what is good and what is bad, or at least a professed belief system. And so a lot of those things, baked into that, no matter how well it's written, there's going to be these sort of uneasy or unbelievable. It's going to break your verisimilitude. It's not going to be able to maintain verisimilitude to the audience. I think that was sort of the main thrust of it. And it's basically the argument is that it is not, I guess the last major aspect is it's not necessarily a bad thing not to be explicit. I want to be like very clear, because some people misunderstood and thought I was saying non-didactic or moral certitudinous writings are inferior, which is the opposite of what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is no such thing as completely absent. Writing is completely absent of it. And so as a creator, you can either you should feel comfortable opting to include or be aware of your own moral certitudes, your own value system. I don't know that, and because a lot of people, I think, fear doing it or don't fear enough in some cases. But so I guess it was supposed to be more of a freeing thing, hopefully, for people to read, to say, you know what, maybe I should include more clarity on like why the world works this way. And with Improvidence as sort of the example, I think it's very clear. It's never stated like with certainty that things are a certain way because of a certain thing, right? Like the captain has his viewpoints, his religion has certain viewpoints, but it's never definitive. And I don't actually believe anyone is necessarily right or a good person, but the way the world works, like the cause and effect, it's not exactly like our world, right? Like in reality, you probably would get away with more things than he gets away with, or certain things wouldn't work out that way. But it's within, again, from my human mind to conceive of it, there is a structure from it. And I don't think any human mind can actually grapple with all of reality. So we have to have these sort of frameworks, these simplified frameworks to even construct something.
Yeah, and there are a few things there, because when you're writing, suppose you're writing with an explicit moral framework, or a character has an explicit moral framework. In the case of the captain, his moral framework, he'll say certain things are moral or heavily imply it. That doesn't necessarily have to be the same moral framework of the author. Like an author can write a character with a different moral framework to their own, and so long as it's consistent, it functions. And in fact, a lot of really interesting fiction comes from explorations of people with just totally different moral frameworks. So because it was released recently on this show, we did an episode on Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Do I think Nabokov was a pedophile and thought it was fine? Like, probably not. But part of what makes Lolita so interesting is you are actually grappling with a man who, at the very least implicitly, feels his behavior is in some way justified, at least for much of the book. And that's really fascinating. Your point about needing to view the world through some sort of framework, I think, is right. And also you think about what the counterfactual in literature would be like, of a world where in some way like moral causation doesn't exist, if it's just chaos. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think it could be interesting briefly, but it would be hard to sustain because it would be so chaotic if things were just random. And also it would be hard to see or to understand character motivations if, again, they were behaving according to actually no morality. And that doesn't mean, say, an immoral perspective from the perspective of another morality. No, like a completely amoral perspective. It's just random. That would make for briefly interesting, but ultimately probably fairly unfulfilling art. I guess also I'm actually not sure to what extent people actually do believe that a didactic work is bad and how much they're just repeating it because they've heard someone else say it. But it's never bothered me too much. Like you said, it's more a question of how well is it done or not, because it can be very obnoxious and it can be easily obnoxious. But similarly, there are plenty of really fantastic works which have a very, very clear morality and in which the author is actually quite interested in making you believe in the same morality as what they believe.
Yeah. I think someone in the comments suggested like, oh, you should add Brother K or something as an example.
Absolutely, Brother K,
yeah. Whatever I had. I think I had Shakespeare in there, which in hindsight wasn't like the clearest example, but yeah, I agree with that point.
Brothers K is a great example because Like the entire book, the murder, the physical evidence, the trial, all of it basically mirrors the problem of faith in God. Like it's pretty clear what Dostoevsky wants you to take away from it in a very didactic sense. He just does it very well, and so it's not seen as obnoxious.
I have a follow-up plan that hopefully will be out like by the time this goes out, but I guess I can share like what my main thesis. I'm curious your thoughts on my, because I put that article, Cairo Smith, friend of your show, my show. I know you're hoping to talk to him pretty soon. And he had a response with some counterpoints. So, I'm going to, I guess, give us some other additional thoughts on it. But the main one I want to give is, I guess, the implication. And I mentioned briefly how there's not a lot of interfaith dialogue between art scenes, right? Like I gave the example of like a Catholic art scene and a Satanist art scene. Like you're not sharing readers, you're not having a conversation because you have fundamentally a different framework. Well, some art scenes you can, where people have different values. And actually, shout out to Post-Liberal Book Reviews, who gave it a good review of Improvidence.
Hoping to get him on the show. He writes really good reviews.
Yeah, really does.
Like shockingly good, especially for the number of subscribers he has on Substack.
Yeah, he needs to get bigger. So yeah, I
much
definitely
bigger.
need to promote him more, as much as is in our power. He had a comment about, within more alternative spheres, that there's different labels needed, and that there's like, Bappian apocalypse or something like that. Somewhat tongue in cheek, but there's a need for these sort of different genres that follows on interestingly from this line of thought, where maybe the genres are like the framework, moral framework, or like ideological framework in a non-cringy way. So it's not like rah rah my party. It's more just an interesting story within like mystery or sci-fi or whatever, fantasy, or just contemporary, but it has the moral implications and viewpoint from one of these like sort of more arising. Some of them are more traditional, having sort of a second rising ideologies. And the idea I have, building slightly on that and the things we just described about the need for having some kind of framework, is that I think as modern people, we're polluted with a very wrong idea. We've been indoctrinated to a very incorrect idea that there's such a thing as a national culture. And my idea is that there is no true national culture. You can have so culture is, one-to-one, is people interacting with each other. And there's sort of like a Dunbar number of the number of creatives, I think, that can form and like create a culture, because it's communication, it's social in many ways. And so I think at any large scale, like larger than a village or a tribe, I think culture can only be like impressed upon people through violence, covert action, or mechanical control of like the means of sharing culture. And so as the children of the TV, like we're the grandchildren of the television and the radio prior to that, there was this sort of dominant culture and moral framework that was impressed upon everyone. And that was normie culture, normal culture, whatever the other memes you want to call it. Like that was that culture. And I think due to the internet and maybe just the unsustainability of that model, I think people are waking up. And that's why ideas like the ones in Improvidence and other books, I think hopefully are like the first steps in like getting people excited in an interesting way to, I guess, engage with some of these, like whatever you want to call it. Like the new wave is what Cairo calls it. Post-liberal books obviously thinks of it as post-liberal, which I think is actually a better way. We're kind of waking up from the idea of quote unquote liberalism, this sort of like monoculture dominant by a single hegemon, like what was basically the US hegemon. And the ability to sustain that culture is breaking down. And so I think new ones are arising. And I think so I guess I'm curious what you think about that. The idea that there is no such thing as a national culture, it's impossible, or it can be impressed upon people, but at that point, they're not participating in it. They are receiving culture from whoever rules them, which is not to say that's a bad thing. Like large governments will always exist, I'm sure, as long as there's people. But it's not the same as like a living culture, a genuine culture of interaction and exchange.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Sorry, I just threw like 20 bullet points.
It depends on what sort of scale you're looking at things on, and your idea of a living culture. I do want to return to, because that's also part of the animating principle behind Tookie's Mag and the Sidebar podcast. So maybe this is just me being inherently elitist. I think to a large extent, a lot of I think, if I'm getting your definition of living culture correct, so culture generated by people interacting with each other, bouncing ideas off each other, generating things, probably made by a relatively small portion of the population. And most people receive that, and in receiving it and perpetuating it in their day-to-day life, embed it, really territorialize it. So you probably always have a fairly small motor of growth, or I guess deterritorialization in terms of ideas. Media of communication do really change the dynamics, in that how easy is it to get a signal out, and how easy is it to have competing signals. So say with radio and television as forms of communication technology, which really favored big centralized generators of culture and distribution, you probably had more of a national culture, or just a larger culture, a culture going far beyond, say, any sort of Dunbar number of people. And it was much easier to homogenize, because there were only so many sources of information available. Something like the internet, something like podcasting or any sort of social media platform, makes the cost of at least putting information out there effectively zero. It goes so close to zero. You run into an interesting different problem, which then is, how do people pass all of this information? In which case, though, you then get, there's a small number of people who get some sort of following, who are trusted in some way, who become effectively trusted places of exchange of ideas, or of the solidification of cultures. I guess, yeah, the question is almost always of at what scale are you looking at? So, say in the Western world, still very much the dominant background of thought is liberal. And for American listeners, when I say liberal, I don't mean, say, voting for the Democratic Party, because I make sure to say this because there's been confusion a few times when Levi or I have used the term liberal with Americans. We meant liberalism as in like the intellectual tradition of, say, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, progressing forwards in time. Like that's the background of almost all thought in the Western world. So you can say there's a national culture or a civilizational culture if you look at it with that little resolution. But then as you look into it in more and more and more detail, you see fairly big differences within that. So maybe it's also a question of at what scale are you considering things?
Yeah. Actually, there was an interesting comment on this, or I brought it up during our fictosexuality episode on Tookie's Mag, which we just did. And it was kind of brushed over in favor of gooning talk on Fortunate AI girlfriends. So I didn't get to dive into as deep as I want, but the scale thing, I think is the essential question. But there's this idea, I don't even remember where I originally read this, but going back to early, tribal humans, like the leap from tribal to like agrarian society and the structure of it, there's this idea that this fictional relationship with a leader, this is specific to like tribal leaders and like kings, but this idea that a fictional relationship with like, oh, I am, a loyal servant of this guy who I've never met, because I'm born in this kingdom and I am from this, which is not to say you don't maybe have some sort of legal obligation or whatever, but it's fundamentally a fictional relationship, since you literally have not met and engaged with this person. That was sort of like an evolutionary leap in no, evolution is not the right word, but it's sort of a leap. It was a leap in human thought, for good or ill, in a way of conceptualizing society that has carried over to today. And then, that gets larger with ideas like, nationalism growing and become more of a thing. Again, not to say people do not have group identities or anything in the least, but that you have a fictional, it's like literally fictional that you have in your head that you have a relationship with these people. As logical as it can be to maybe cooperate with them, there is like a core of fiction there, a fictional relationship. So I was applying this idea of fictosexuality to more, I guess, political thought. And so then I guess to extend it to the modern day and your comment about this, like what scale am I talking about? And still not totally sure. Like I'm still kind of, I don't know, like noodling on these ideas.
It's also a gigantic question.
It is, yeah. But I guess the question I raised to them that again was diverted in talking about AI girlfriends.
Gabe really wants an AI girlfriend. It's probably
literally
doesn't mean
half the
that much
episode, man.
Yeah, to people who don't listen to Sidebar Podcast, go listen to it. I'll put the link to it in the show notes.
Yeah,
Gabe was talking a lot about AI girlfriends.
50-minute episode with an extra 50-minute episode about AI girlfriends tacked on the back. These fictional relationships in the modern day, like are a very powerful, like engine of social cohesion, and so culture in that way is a source of social cohesion through ficto relationships. And the example I used in that episode was like Christianity, where you have a fictional relationship. You can have. I'm not discrediting anyone having a spiritual connection with Jesus or Muhammad or whoever, but from the text, reading the text, you have a fictional relationship with that person. You have a fictional understanding of them. Not to say that the text itself is fiction. Maybe a different term would be better, but you have a scriptural relationship in that case.
Could it be almost an interior or an exterior relationship? Like an exterior relationship is, I don't know, if I see my parents, like they're people standing in front of me, I'm having a relationship with them mediated by both parties, whereas almost an interior relationship, it's, me thinking about Elon Musk, like I've never met the guy, he doesn't know who I am. I don't know him personally, I just know what I've read of him. It's an entirely inner experience of Elon Musk on my part.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. Because you have very strong opinions and you have things you hope for him. Like it is you call it like an interior relationship. And I guess in my phrasing, I'm calling it a, like, I don't know. He's not fictosexual because he's a real person. Or it's not a ficto relationship. It's I think I need a new term for this.
Like a fictional relationship, though, it is interesting because I'm not sure where you would draw the line between, say, someone who has a very, very strong idea of who Elon Musk is, very strong opinions about Elon Musk, all just from reading the newspaper, versus someone who loves some fictional character or seen a character in a movie or a TV show or a game or read about them in a book and has very strong feelings about them as well. It's very unclear to me where the dividing line between those two things is, or if there is a meaningful distinction between them.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a kid barge in. I missed the back half of that. Could you repeat the last part?
I was just saying, so that I'm not sure how I would distinguish clearly between someone who has a very, very clear idea of Elon Musk that they've gotten from reading the newspaper, for example, or paying attention to the news, versus someone who has very, very strong feelings about who a character in a book is, or a game, or a film, or a TV show that they spend a lot of time thinking about. I guess one of them they'll have derived from notionally non-fictional sources. The fact remains, though, is that you have no personal relationship with this person you're reading about or learning about. They're still actually being constructed within you.
So maybe it is still a ficto relationship, even if it's largely correct, like to the material world.
In a biographic sense, it's correct, but you're still not maintaining a relationship with a human being. You're maintaining a relationship with descriptions of a human being.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And the implication for that, like at a societal level, is people feel they have a relationship with this person. And in many ways, like the story of the last, 70 years is the power of people that can have fictional relationships with large quantities of people, like, politicians. I guess maybe there's a lot more power behind the scenes, people to control like the mechanics of power, but there's in the popular consciousness, maybe even it's a false impression, the popular consciousness that power is derived through the ability to like maintain these, I keep saying fictive relationships. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm going to come up with a
virtual
better
relationships. Because it's not to say that they're not real. It's like the subjective experience of quote unquote knowing Elon Musk is like that has an effect on people's behavior. It's not that it's something that doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. It's in the same way it's, you could say the country of Australia exists in your head because say, without human beings believing in it, it doesn't exist. But that's not to say Australia as a concept is not meaningful and doesn't have real effects in the world. Yeah, terminology about how to describe this type of relationship is...
Yeah, and it's tough because I distinguish it from material beliefs, because there is the whole thing like, well, what does it matter if you think the world is flat or not? Because ultimately, unless you're flying an airplane or in a spaceship, it's not really going to matter very much. And so there is these sort of like stark reality things, and I would distinguish that from relationships with people, like interiorized relationships with another person, in that I guess one, there's like ongoing behaviors, and then there's like implications for like loyalty and how you should maybe modify your morality. I guess like how it ties back to this didacticism is that you either, like with Elon Musk as your example, I think it's a good one because he is so divisive. Like a lot of people really have strong opinions, and I never got, to be honest. I've always found him kind of interesting, but I can't say these people really love or hate him for some reason.
Like, I find him interesting from the perspective of he's clearly extremely talented at starting businesses or acquiring a business like Tesla and then just making it bigger. He is really good at that. I'm not that interested in him beyond that. Like, I both don't think that he's a threat to our democracy because he shares the wrong things on X.com. I also don't think he's the coming Red Caesar.
Yeah, same.
I guess this is all this the it's not fictosexuality, but you're getting a bit too into a relationship with the idea of a person.
But at the same time, it could be of critical importance to your life, your fictional relationship. So maybe, because, there's the whole idea that human beings, our brains are so big because we evolved to be social, and that was one of the big drivers of it. I don't know how true or not that is, but it's a concept. And it can be like, think of revolutionary France, your ficto, or like your interior relationship with certain concepts and leaders was the difference in life or death. And in any kind of like tribal crisis, like your ability to organize your opinions of certain people in a way, I don't even know if it's necessarily accurate or not, because your info is never pure. You never have like perfect clarity, but your ability to read those tea leaves like can be the difference between life and death, even if they're not right, like even if they're not like correct, and in 10 years everyone's going to renounce, like, oh wow, some of those Soviet ideas were a little bit kooky, but if you didn't play the right game at the time, I don't know, it's just there's a bazillion like ways to go with it, and I don't want to like sidetrack too much, but it's just I'm still like kind of wrestling with these two ideas together, this like didacticism and like these cultural engines of people to create culture and share culture, and then the role of that with ficto relationships to, we're talking about politicians and such now, but also I think just very important too is, the cultural scene and like authors, people believing in Holden Caulfield, and things like that can be powerful. Yeah. And shape the culture.
To say these, for want of a better term, fictional relationships are unimportant because they're fictional is, I think, to completely miss the point. I think you're right that they have real world effects, like as in material world effects. They are really important in terms of motivating behavior.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's kind of a sickness too. Like if you think of there's the dare I say it, Trump versus Kamabla thing. Like the level of attachment people have to these things. I guess that maybe that's another thing with the whole Tuki's sidebar, our podcast, and the idea of new culture, living culture, is to reject some of these old model, debond, unprogram some people, hopefully, that are plugged into that, and maybe replace it with a healthy relationship with the my girlfriend in my book, who's my my fictional girlfriend. we can share, just. I don't know. It's like a real means of control. And so I guess I view that a little bit as people making new culture can act as like a jammer, right? You're interfering with the ability of people to connect with some of those more, what's the word? Detrimental, negative, external. I don't know. Yeah. Detrimental, just say that, relationships, and maybe, and in some ways maybe, and you're better off with a more harmless fictive relationship, because I also don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Like hopefully this doesn't sound like I'm saying it's bad to have fictional relationships, because as you were saying with Elon and others, it's just part of the way we conceptualize people. It's like, oh, I know Elon, like I'm aware, like I have a sort of internal relationship with him as a person, as a concept. Yeah, but
I think it's extremely powerful, especially as a way to get people to coordinate, and especially people who don't know each other, getting them to coordinate in space and time. This ability to maintain fictional relationships is extremely powerful. And so the detrimental aspects of it are, well, which relationships are you maintaining? Are you maintaining them at the expense of relationships with flesh and blood humans who know who you are? I guess it's sort of trite to say, but like anything that's extremely powerful, it can have big downsides as well as big upsides.
Yeah.
Interested to get you to talk about living culture as well. So when you were on the podcast previously, I'm not sure if you said it before we started recording or at the very beginning of the episode, but part of your motivation behind Tuki's Mag and the Sidebar podcast was to explore living culture. So you cover books, I think it was that were published within the past 2 years.
Yeah.
What's living culture? And I have a feeling for why it's important, but why do you think it's so important?
It's kind of tied to, it's kind of an argument against, or a battle against internet incentives, and algorithm incentives in a way. The idea of living culture is, things, recent releases, things from people that are alive, things that are from within the last 2 years roughly. We've broken that rule a handful of times, but that's the sort of stated goal, is to cover new stuff and to create new culture, because what I see, my conception of culture the last 10 years or whatever with the internet as an accelerant is it's increasingly backwards looking, and not necessarily just because we've lost the sauce, but also just in a pure algorithm way. If you are trying to capture broad audience in this sort of international online space, you have to go back to the well of things that have cachet or awareness, or I think of when I make thumbnails or something. You have to kind of sell out there. You got to put something that's just something someone will recognize. You have to put Mickey Mouse on the freaking cover of everything, or a pretty girl, or the equivalent. And so I see this. I was thinking of like YouTube. If you go to Book Talk or BookTube and things like that, you will get a million videos about who is H.P. Lovecraft, who is H.G. Wells, who are these big guys from way back, and big channels just put out the same videos, the same content about the same dozen authors, or the same, and this is just within the book world. It extends to the movie world with obviously sequelitis and rebootitis. And so the idea of living culture is like a purposeful cutting off of all of that as much as possible, swearing it off, not to diminish the accomplishments of that, but to, say this is a space for only new ideas, new material. And to create a living conversation. It kind of goes back to our earlier comment about didacticism and talking across party lines, as it were, or moral frameworks. I think that's where the interesting stuff is. I already know what happened, in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s. I kind of know what frameworks were dominant, but I think it's interesting to look at the seedbed of new ideas.
So was it the term new wave gets thrown around, I was going to say a lot, but not really a lot. So in the particular part of Substack that I inhabit, for example, you hear people like Cairo Smith, who wrote a response to your piece on didactic fiction called "You Can't Fight the New Wave." Also, ARX Han talks about it. Post-liberal book reviews, I don't think he's used the term new wave. I think he prefers post-liberal. Yeah. But I'm sure he's aware of this term. Was that a neologism coined by Gabe Sinclair of the Sidebar podcast? Or have I got that completely wrong?
It was. It's been a source of great strife. Gabe coined it unintentionally. I think he wasn't using it as a proper noun or anything. He was, small n, small w, new wave. But he was talking about a new wave of writers. Then I think Eric's Han understood it to be like applied as a term, and they kind of talked about it for a bit. But yeah, it is a Gabeism, and I am battling it with my Didacticism is Good series. So hopefully I could smite the beast. But I see, and I don't begrudge them like playing with terms. I think it's fun to play with terms. I just don't think, I think new wave is too generic. It doesn't like, I feel like a lot of the new writers in this scene are post-liberal in a way. And people get salty and edgy, but I just feel like the star of liberalism has sort of been declining. Whatever is in the future remains to be seen. But I think a lot of these interesting alternative ideas are people that are, ideological atheists who are sort of seeking a value system that actually makes sense and has some predictive power. Because if you were a liberal, the last 20 years don't make a ton of sense. Like a lot of ideology is like a predictive engine. And it's your ability to say the king has died, so what will happen next? And it's okay, well, do I believe a ground spring of democracy will suddenly rise up? Do I believe, maybe a different sort of natural theory of power, like elite theory or something? And so I think, that's where it's coming from. The need for it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess any sort of conceptual framework of the world is not what the world is. There is distinction between the map and the territory.
Yes, 100%.
Obviously. And or basically every intellectual exploration is an exercise in cartography. And as the world shifts enough underneath you, then your old maps are going to be less and less accurate. So it could be that. Would you consider yourself part of the new wave, or you just don't really identify with the term at all?
I don't identify with the term, but I identify with the people in it. Like I think we are all in a group. I just don't think their labeling is good. I think their labeling is, like I said in the article, a little bit generic, a little bit of hiding behind the skirts of a dead goddess, is what I say in the article, pretending like we're not too chuddy, which is fine. A lot of them are not. Don't identify with some aspects of the online sphere that they sometimes engage with. Which I understand, like there are more extreme and weird people that I don't agree with or have a lot of common ground on, but I see them floating around on that online world. But I think new wave, is a deliberate, if you're wearing that as the banner on you, I think it's deliberately weak. And I think it's a losing battle because nobody wants to be part of a wishy-washy, unclear, my whole thing with there's no such thing as a national culture. If you're trying to appeal to a national culture, if it ever existed, it sure as hell does not exist now. So you're self-moderation is not going to impress people. But then 2, you're going to just allow in people that don't share some of your more interesting values. And you're just, I think the future, like the past, like the present, belongs to the fanatics. It belongs to the actual, like the term cult, people, has negative connotations, but like fundamentally it's a sort of inward reflecting group that seeks to develop culture, to grow, to improve. And so I think any culture, like actual genuine living culture, is people, a certain number of people with some coming and going, internally developing an ideological good framework, ideas. Again, not to the exclusion of art. If it's an art, art development, you're making the best art you can, but there's a certain shared set of worldviews or similar enough worldviews that can collaborate and create that culture. And so if you're just saying we're new wave, we're just, the only thing that's new about us is that we're new. we weren't here 100 years ago. We won't be here in 100 years. We are new until we're not new. To me, that's very self-defeating. That's why I see that it's so.
So in the case of an artistic movement, I'll just use the term new wave for...
How dare you?
for clarity as a shorthand. And so when I say new wave, I mean authors like Cairo Smith, ARX Hahn. You probably would be lumped in there too. People like PCM Christ publish a new book. That would probably be lumped in there. Nutcranker by Dan Baltic. So Dragon Day or the Black Album by Matt Pager's probably be put in there too. So when I say new wave, I mean that loose constellation of people who appear on each other's podcasts, really. Do you think an artistic movement needs an ideological core in order to communicate and to improve each other's work, to understand each other's work? Or can there just be, say, a shared aesthetic sense, or even just a shared location, and that location can even be somewhere like online, so the algorithm on a particular social media site just clumps those people together, and that's enough of a co-location to form a culture or some sort of movement? Does it need a firm ideological center in order to persist?
I think it maybe not that it needs it, but it will form just through human interaction. Okay. So if you are co-located even virtually or in the same place, then that's how tribes form. And I guess that's one of the ideas behind Improvidence, is sort of unstated, is sort of this re-tribalization of man, the emergence of new tribes, almost like a new Bronze Age, like new races have risen from the decline of a previous civilization. And so in this online writer sphere context, I think it's inevitable that it will form. People will have conversations and values, and people that don't share those values get excluded, and the people that do collaborate. I think it's just a human self-sorting process of tribalization, and unless absent like a controlling like super state to force behavior, people will tribalize. And I think that's also part of, I think, the declining super states, which I think are like due to material conditions. I think it's due to like energy resources and access to that. I think we're like they're starting to lose some of their power maybe, and I think they will continue to. But independent of that, even just, I think an artistic scene, whether they state it or not, will develop a certain aesthetic that includes a moral assumption or lack of certain moral assumptions. I just think it's the way people work. I think people are fundamentally tribal. I think any group of people that interact for more than a month are going to just start, socially forming each other into a tribe.
Yeah, there are a few things there, because one is the dynamics of the online world, in that entering and importantly exiting any sort of social circle is extremely easy, which you would expect for there to be some sort of durable phenomenon like a literary scene. You probably would need some sort of quite strong coordinating function going on. And if at the moment it's people who are publishing interesting things that are not getting conventionally published. Say, like Nutcranker by Dan Baltic or Incel by ARX Hahn. I think both of those are easily high quality enough to be conventionally published, but they're not being. And at least at the moment, that seems to be a large part of the coordinating function of the new wave. I wonder if it will form something durable enough if those people start getting published and getting that big five money. Mm-hmm. If there's going to be something to hold it together beyond basically being kind of outsiders, and for that reason making interesting art, but also for that reason not necessarily having much in common beyond what they in a shared sense don't have, which is access to the big five publishers.
Well, I think two things. One, I don't think there's a lot of money from big five publishers either. So you are a published author. Yeah, your first commission, I think the best you can hope for is like $7,000 or something like that. Typically, like it's, I'm not saying no to $7,000 if someone offers it, but
yeah, but I'm living that obscure podcaster life. I need a lot more than $7,000 to get me out of bed in the morning.
Amen. Yeah, you got to give me 1 million subs. We'll talk. Give me some bots. So I guess that's the first part. The second part, I just think they are. I think whether they want to be, ARX Hahn in particular, I think didn't choose this. He didn't ask for this, but he is, by his beliefs, unfortunately, like one of us. Like he's a little uncomfortable in his skin, I think. In some ways, I think he has anxiety. And sorry, now I'm like psychologically analyzing ARX if you hear this, sorry. But because he's an Asian American, I think he has this like concern about more white nationalist type elements in the right wing. Understandably so, or white supremacist types, which I think is like maybe someone from his earlier programming that thinking these people are prominent or something. And Cairo, anyway, all that to say, I think they have, for personal reasons, some less comfort with certain aspects of this scene, which does not, the new wave does not include any of those types to begin with. I'm trying to think how to phrase this, but I don't think if they want to, like, let's say Dan got published, even if he didn't speak to us anymore, I would still consider him to be of the same milieu, because of his, my understanding of his moral frameworks and the way it shows up in his writing, which I don't agree with Dan Baltic on certain things. Like we're not, we don't vote the same or whatever, however you want to say it in that kind of crude way. But we have a lot in common in the, I think it's we're just going back to like, what is the right word for this? Basically, like, is it new wave? I think post-liberal makes sense. It's not sexy at all. So we need a better term than that, because post-liberal does not sound sexy. It sounds like political. Like, oh, we're right-wing artists, which also doesn't sound cool. You do need something.
That sounds so lame.
Yeah, exactly. You need something that's something snappy. And so I think it's cool to brainstorm it. And new wave is just a miss for me. I might come out with like 2 or 3 recommendations. They'll probably get ignored, but probably it'll be named retrospectively, in like 5 years. Hopefully a few people got a little bigger. Even if they didn't, I'm sure it'll be easier to label as a phenomenon once it's been around for a while, or even concluded or evolved into something else.
Look, a big part of me does want it to become a movement, which was named by accident by a throwaway comment by Gabe Sinclair in a sidebar episode.
He would hang that hat on his wall forever. He would frame that.
I would really, really enjoy that. So in terms of this scene, like just whatever you want to call it, we'll leave problems of terminology to the side. It's why it's nice to be able to talk about it more at length, because you can get a sense of what it is apart from quibbles people may or may not have with the name. But in this particular cluster of authors, are there any authors that you want to shout out that you think are really, really worth paying attention to?
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I mentioned before we started recording, but Mixtape Hyperborea by Adam Luz Reinspex came out a year or so ago. It was the first episode we ever did on Sidebar, and I feel bad because it was like the audio quality was terrible. We were literally just met. We were just kind of doing it as a one-off for fun. And so maybe we'll do a Redux someday, but it's one of those, it's an easy recommend if you're interested in sort of a coming of age story of an American high schooler in the year 2000 or so, pre-internet. It's a very, very sweet story. And I think probably the other ones are probably the ones you've mentioned. Incel, Nutcranker. Nutcranker I could recommend to anybody. That's just like anyone that's online.
It looks great fun.
Yeah. This is the beauty of a comedy. Like it's just who doesn't need like some more laughter in their life.
I just Spencer Grunhauer is a wonderful character and one that it's good fun to have living in your head, having read Nutcranker.
Let me just look up what we've done in the past and see if there's anything I missed. You can feel free to cut this if it's too long of a silence. Because another one that's really good that is not contemporary at all. So I'm sorry, I'm like kind of breaking my own rule. But My Confession by Samuel Chamberlain. It's not a world war. It's a what is it? Mexican-American War. Travelogue, which I'm a huge sucker for travelogues, as you can probably tell. So absolutely, I recommend that one. Oh, you know what else is pretty good? There's some good stuff coming from Unreal Press. The guys I mentioned, I do this stuff. It's free on their Substack. So if you look up Unreal Press, they do a lot of short story anthologies, and you can find people that are really good in there. But you know what I'm reading right now that is good is I'm sorry, this is the last one I promise is Shagduk by what is his name? So I don't remember his name. I haven't finished it yet, but it's excellent read so far. It's sort of setting in the 1970s Texas about a demon being summoned accidentally.
Nice. It's really exciting how many people are writing and publishing things at the moment. The problem really is visibility. It's how do you find and get good recommendations for good books coming out that are not getting much publicity necessarily.
Yeah, the review engine is totally broken. We were chatting about that for a minute before we started recording, but unfortunately, the other, I guess, part of the living culture battle we're fighting is that there's this social media backpatting dynamic where, you want to give a positive review to everyone because you're paid in views, you're not paid in money like a old reporter at a newspaper, right? So it's really favorable to give someone a good review if they're popular, even if their stuff is total garbage. And so unfortunately I find a lot of people and also taste is hard. Everyone has different taste, but a lot of people I would say don't have like the most, I don't know, discerning taste from a friend, which is fine. Like if they're your friend, you want to help them, but it's a real, I think that's one of the biggest uphill struggles in the scene, which we're in our way, small way trying to like battle, but the social media dynamics of reviewing are rough.
Well, yeah, on the Sidebar podcast, all three of you are very close readers, and all three of you are very happy to criticize books.
Hopefully not in a malicious way. Like we once or twice we went too far early on, and I kind of regret it. We've mostly moderated. I hope. I don't know.
Yeah, now it's mostly talk about AI girlfriends.
we've totally sold out, yeah.
So, are there any other projects that you want people to be aware of yours that I can put in the show notes? So, of course, I'm going to leave links to where to get Improvidence. I'm going to leave link to Tookie's Mag, the Sidebar podcast. Is there anything else that you're working on?
No, that's really it. As you know, it's a big time commitment to do podcasts, and I do the editing for our mainline series, and then sometimes Gabe and Cap do live streams. But really the Substack is where I do is a lot of essays, and then that are I guess more culture oriented, but also some random fiction. I just a skippity toilet like flash fiction for whatever reason, and then the podcast series is more modern literature, and then we do topic episodes too if you want something kind of more fun just to jump in randomly. Like we have the femgooning episode. We have some other ones that just hopefully gives a broader appeal. That's also part of we're trying to strike the balance in if you just sing to the same choir, it can be hard. So in fact, I'm trying purposefully to pigeonhole us less into a dissident right sphere. You can become very, very insular doing that. And so I'm consciously trying to move out and read some things from other people. I'm not sure yet if you guys or if anyone has any recommendations, I'd be super interested. Like, feel free to drop them, but someone who's not from that scene exactly that would be good to cover. We have some ideas, but yeah, that's kind of our goal right now.
No, we definitely like to do some more books from the left on this show as well. The problem is they tend to get fewer views. So if it were up to me, we'd do a lot more Georges Bataille, because I just really, really enjoy his work. But pretty consistently, people just don't listen to our Bataille episodes much.
Interesting.
Which will make it harder for me to convince Levi to read parts 2 and 3 of The Accursed Share, which I'd love to talk about.
Actually, I'm part of the problem. I actually skipped that episode. Oh no. I didn't know what it was about.
It's basically just a weird French coom goblin who reverses the central problem of economics of, okay, well, the problem is limited resources with alternative uses, to what if our problem is superabundance and accumulation, eventually leading to explosive expenditure, and then constructing an economic theory on that.
That sounds like a classic leftist ideology. It's like, oh, let's invent an airplane for a zero gravity world. Okay, let's do it.
I love Bataille so much. I would cover so many of his books on the podcast if I had the time.
I have to check that one out. Now, you sold me. Next time, put that in the thumbnail. A coom goblin that creates the new economy. That sounds like, I don't know what the riddle with that is hard. You could get a like a lefty guest, someone that's like maybe has a little bit of a following to bring in some people interested in that. Maybe that's the solution. But I know it's hard to get people. That's the other thing.
There are a few I want to get on. I want to get Swallowteriod on, because he's a guy who just talks about the gym and Leninism.
That sounds awesome.
Like a proper tanky. No, there are people I have my eye on, and I really should invite them on. It's also just the coordination is more difficult.
And with the stuff we do, it's like there's reading and prep too. So there's always that anxiety they're not going to be done in time, or they lose track and then they cancel right before. It's a little bit of a higher effort project to have to read an entire book before you show up for something. And you never know if your reading is going to be good, or I don't know, maybe hypothetically someone just leaves 15 minutes into an episode. That could happen.
But thanks so much for coming on. So once again, for listeners, it was Improvidence by David Herod. Is that your...
Yeah, it's my pen name.
Your pen name?
Yeah.
Really recommend the book. It's a really brisk, really quick book that, especially the depictions of the landscape are really transporting and really, really well worth your time. No, as well as that, the Tookies or Tookies mag, I keep changing the pronunciation.
We all do.
On Substack, as well as the associated Sidebar podcast. Well worth your time. Really, really recommend them. So thanks very much for coming on. Open invitation to come back on the show.
Thank you. Likewise, we're going to get you guys on at some point. We've had a book planned to do with you for a while that has just not been published for reasons we still don't understand, but eventually it will happen. For sure.
When it does happen, we'd love to come on Sidebar Podcast. So thanks very much.
No, absolutely. And thank you for the shout out and being kind enough to engage with my stuff and share it. I just hugely appreciate it. As you know, it's a battle to get eyes, and I will, if anyone listens this long, I will put the book Improvidence on sale. It's hopefully a fun, brisk read with some ideas behind it. If you're interested in the ideas behind it, I have an essay called Petroleum Culture that kind of relates to some of the concepts that you don't need to read at all to enjoy the book, but it's sort of some fun context.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. All right.
Absolutely.
See you next time.
Bye.